Okay, welcome everyone to the final lecture of the Expanding Empathy 2021 speaker series. I'm Daryl Cameron, your host. We've been organizing this series through the Rock Ethics Institute here at Penn State University. This is, again, through the Moral Agency and Moral Development Initiative at the Rock Ethics Institute that I spearhead that initiative. With the Rock, this is also being co-sponsored by the Psychology Department here at Penn State, also the Prevention Research Center at in Human Development and Family Studies. I want to introduce Dr. Everett, Dr. Jim A.C. Everett, who is our final speaker. He is an assistant professor at the University of Kent in England and research associate at the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. And Jim's work focuses on moral judgment, perceptions of moral character, and proto-utilitarianism. He did his work, his baccalaureate work and his PhD at the University of Oxford before receiving a Fulbright Fellowship to work at Harvard University and Marie Sklodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellowship to work at Leiden University. What's especially interesting about his work is it's very interdisciplinary because not only does he draw upon traditional social psychology, but also philosophy, behavioral economics, evolutionary theory. He has focused in a lot of his work that I'll talk about today on how we incorporate partiality into our moral judgments, how we infer character and personality traits from moral judgments, and why this is important, how we assign animals moral worth, and how our moral beliefs influence our understanding of free will and determinism. He's published his work in a lot of the top journals in psychology, including Psychological Review, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. It's been featured in a lot of high-profile outlets like The Times, The Guardian, The Daily Mail, The New York Times. He received a prestigious Early Career Award from the European Association for Social Psychology, and his work that we'll talk about today received the Wegner Theoretical Innovation Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. So I think this last talk of the series will be really interesting in integrating a lot of the insights from what we've learned about over the 6 talks. And I'm very pleased to have Dr. Everett join us. So whenever you're ready, Jim.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's so nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. I hope you can all see this. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to start with 2 thought experiments. So imagine that on a walk one day, you go past a shallow pond. And so you notice that a child has fallen in and appears to be drowning. So you could wade in and pull this child out, but it does mean that your clothes are going to be ruined. Do you have an obligation to rescue that child? Now, most people say, yes, of course you should wade in, ruin your clothes and save the life of a child. But now imagine that you're in a foreign country. A small child is very close to dying of malnutrition. And actually, for less than the cost of your clothes, you could donate that money and save the child. Are you morally required to do so? Now, here most people say no. But according to theories of utilitarianism, one of the most prominent ethical theories in ethics, there's no meaningful difference between the two. So as Peter Singer, the most influential living utilitarian philosopher, has said, we are all in that situation of the person passing the shallow pond. We could all save the lives of people, both children and adults, who would otherwise die, and we can do so at a very small cost to us. So that's our first thought experiment. The second thought experiment might be familiar to many of you. We can imagine this switch case of the trolley dilemma. A runaway trolley or tram is hurtling down tracks towards 5 people, and you're standing by a switch, and you can flip this lever or switch and direct the trolley onto a separate track where it will kill 1 person instead of 5 people. And if you ask people, should you flip that switch? Most people, typically around 70 to 80%, say yes, you should flip that switch. You should kill the 1 person and save the 5. But now imagine that instead of a switch or a lever, you're standing on a footbridge and you have to push this large man off the bridge using his body as a means in order to save the 5 people so that his body will stop the train in its tracks. And if you ask people here, should you do this? Most people say no. It's a complete reverse of what we see in the switch case. And yet, according to utilitarianism, these two cases are philosophically the same. There's no ethical, meaningful difference between the two. And this is what has been called the trolley problem. The utilitarianism is a dominant, one of the most influential ethical theories now. And it's a type of consequentialism. And the kind of classical utilitarianism we talk about in moral psychology. The key idea is very simple, and this is that the whole of morality can be deduced from a single general principle. Always act in a way that would impartially maximize aggregate well-being. That is, when faced with a moral decision, we should weigh up the pros and cons. We should look at the consequences of our actions and decide based on that how to proceed. Utilitarianism has a long historical tradition. It starts in Victorian England with Jeremy Bentham, closely followed by John Stuart Mill, and is associated now, as I mentioned, with Peter Singer, an Australian philosopher. And in moral psychology, utilitarianism is typically contrasted with deontological ethics associated with scholars like Immanuel Kant. And when faced with this trolley problem, which has been widely used in moral psychology, when someone says push, they're described as making a utilitarian decision. Whereas when someone says no, don't push, you can't kill one person to save 5, they're described as making a deontological decision. Trolley problems have been widely discussed, but it's not just about trolley problems. These are not just abstract thought experiments that psychologists like to administer to their unwilling participants in a lab. Sacrifices are often made for the benefit of the greater good. We see this in history, for example, with the potentially apocryphal story of Churchill and whether he should allow the Coventry bombing to go ahead. We see it in classical literature. We see it in modern cinematic literature. We see it in decisions in the military and war. And we see it now in medical moral dilemmas relating to COVID, which I'll come back to later. And the most influential work studying sacrificial dilemmas has come under the dual process model associated with Joshua Green and colleagues. And according to this, there are 2 systems that support moral decision-making. There's this automatic and emotionally grounded system that favors deontological decisions. And there's this deliberative reasoning system that supports utilitarian decisions. Now, part of the reason that this model has been so influential and widespread as a theory, or arguably dominating moral psychology over the last 2 decades, is that it seeks to make conclusions not just about trolley problems, but as a more general theory of moral cognition. For example, it's claimed that these processes generalize beyond sacrificial dilemmas like the trolley problem to other contexts. It's claimed that understanding these dual processes can actually explain away philosophical debate between deontology and consequentialism. And even that this work provides normative support for utilitarianism as a guide for what we should do. But I think this depends on us having a complete picture. And is there a piece of the puzzle missing? And if there is a gap, if there is a piece of this puzzle that's missing, that makes it very difficult for us to make these broader conclusions. Now, I think there is a gap, and some might even say a chasm between what we are studying and these kind of more higher order conclusions that we seek to make. And I think this gap can be seen when we think about the more prototypical positive elements of utilitarianism. Because utilitarianism departs from common sense morality in a host of ways. It's not just about trolley problems. So utilitarianism, for example, provides distinctive views about things such as eating meat and how we should treat animals. So in his wonderful book, Animal Liberation, Peter Singer argues that we need to expand the moral circle to include the roots of utilitarianism as an ethical theory, with Jeremy Bentham writing, "A civilized society must count animals as worthy of moral consideration and ethical treatment. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" And similarly, we can see this in decisions about charitable donations. So for example, Peter Singer in this, The Life You Can Save, draws on these effective altruistic principles to argue that we need to do much more to donate to help people in the developing world, and that we need to be more careful about how we choose to donate to charity in order that we can achieve the greatest good. And so, while there's been a lot of work in moral psychology using trolley dilemmas to understand what I call instrumental harm, there is this other critical dimension of impartial beneficence, the extent to which individuals endorse the impartial promotion of everyone's welfare without regard to distance or personal ties. And this is something that I've been working on since I started as a master's student, actually, with the wonderful, amazing philosopher Guy Kahane at the University of Oxford. And in a series of papers, we've all these papers are joint first authored, a real philosophy and psychology collaboration. We've investigated this, and in particular, in our most recent paper in Trends in Cognitive Science, we identified two key questions that we should ask when trying to understand the relationship between instrumental harm and impartial beneficence. And we consider what that means for understanding utilitarianism. So we identified two key questions. I'll focus today on one, which is the generalizability question. In short, this question is whether these decisions about instrumental harm, the kind of psychological processes underlying them, the individual difference associated with the endorsement of instrumental harm as measured in sacrificial dilemmas, generalizes to these more prototypical positive elements of utilitarianism that we can call impartial beneficence. And if they don't, what does that mean about our theories that came to shed light on utilitarian psychology writ large? In short, my concern is that we have literally decades of amazing, fantastic work studying instrumental harm to understand the psychology of utilitarianism. We have this very detailed understanding, and scholars have painted this rich picture of what kind of people endorse instrumental harm, when they do it, and why. But we have almost none on impartial beneficence, this second really important dimension of utilitarianism. And the key motivation driving my work over the last few years is to start showing that and to argue that we need to finish this drawing and we need to do it properly. So today, I've already started to say how most work studying moral psychology has relied on these sacrificial dilemmas. I've said to you that there's this other key dimension. And now what I'm going to do is show that there's little evidence of generalizability between these dimensions. I'm going to show that they seem to have different patterns of associated individual differences. I'm going to show that they seem to rely on different processes. And finally, I'm going to suggest that they have distinct consequences for social perception. In short, I'm going to say that to understand utilitarian psychology, we have to take a multi-dimensional approach. So the original work here focused in individual differences in our 2015 paper. And what we were interested here in is a number of studies was what kind of individual differences, initially, what kind of individual differences are associated with the endorsement of instrumental harm? And are these what we might expect if these decisions are really reflecting a genuine concern for the greater good? And we found evidence across a number of studies that they don't seem to be. So in line with previous work, endorsement of instrumental harm, that is endorsement of this utilitarian resolution to trolley dilemmas, is associated with egoism. That is the idea that what is rational or even ethical is to do solely what's good for me and not for anyone else. Endorsement of this utilitarian instrumental harm is associated with psychopathy. It's negatively associated with identification with all of humanity, this kind of global impartial core of utilitarianism. And it's negatively associated with empathic concern. And this is all very surprising if we can really describe decisions in these trolley dilemmas as reflecting this utilitarian decision-making process or procedure. But of course, this is all just about individual differences. And a lot of that had been shown before by scholars like Bartels and Pizarro and so on. One of the key things we wanted to do was look at, okay, so when people are making these judgments about instrumental harm, would they also be more likely to make these characteristically utilitarian judgments in this domain of impartial beneficence, although we didn't call it that at that time? And in fact, in 4 experiments, we repeatedly found that this wasn't the case. So we created these greater good dilemmas that would try and test this in an analogous way to how we have sacrificial moral dilemmas. So for example, one of the dilemmas we used was this greater good dilemma. Benjamin is a college student who's always wanted to have his own car. He works after school, he saves his money, he rarely goes out. He's got £7,000. On the way to the car dealership, he reads about the tsunami in Southeast Asia. And he knows that if he could donate this money, it would make a real difference to the victims of the tsunami. How wrong would it be for Benjamin to go on and buy the car rather than donate the money? Another one was, so Mark is a businessman and he's decided he's going to give £1,000 to charity. He's just deciding which one. So the first focuses on preventing disease in the US and would save the life of one child. In the second, charity focuses on preventing disease in a foreign country where the donation could save the lives of several children. And he needs to decide which one. How wrong would it be for Mark to donate the money to the charity in his own country? And what we found across 4 experiments was that this tendency to endorse the sacrifice of one person, this endorsement of instrumental harm, was not associated with these more prototypical decisions relating to impartial beneficence. They weren't correlated. In many cases, they were negatively correlated. And importantly, this negative correlation remained even when we controlled for this antisocial component of utilitarian judgment by controlling for psychopathy. And so as part of that, we suggested that studying sacrificial dilemmas is unlikely to tell us much about utilitarianism in general. So we followed this up in our 2018 Psych Review paper. And as part of this, we wanted to develop a new usable, friendly scale that participants can use to understand, to measure utilitarianism. And in doing so, understand how these items go together, what kind of factor structure emerged. And in line with our earlier work, we found that there were these 2 distinct subscales that emerged. And this is what we call this 2-dimensional model of instrumental harm and impartial beneficence. So for example, an example item of instrumental harm would be if the only way to ensure the overall well-being and happiness of people is to use political oppression, then political oppression should be used. Whereas an example of an impartial beneficence item in this Oxford utilitarianism scale would be, from a moral perspective, people should care about the well-being of all humans on the planet equally. They should not favor the well-being of people who are especially close to them, either physically or emotionally. We validated this with philosophers, including Peter Singer, and consistent with our findings, we found that participants are expert philosopher participants who self-described as adhering most closely to, say, Kantian ethics or other forms of deontology, scored significantly lower than those philosophers who describe themselves as utilitarianism. Unsurprisingly, Peter Singer scored very highly on our scale. And one thing that I just like to point out here, which is something that we noted in this paper and haven't followed up so much on now while we've been pursuing other directions, is how correlated these 2 dimensions were in our expert philosophers, even though in ordinary participants, they tend to be weakly or even negatively correlated. And I think it's a really interesting direction for future work. And so what we found using this scale is again that there was this distinct patterns of individual differences. So instrumental harm was associated with reduced empathic concern, increased conservatism, increased psychopathy, and actually increased endorsements of unambiguously unethical business practices. Whereas impartial beneficence was associated with increased empathic concern, political liberalism, identification with all of humanity, concern with future generations, and religiosity. Okay, so taken together, that work shows that there do seem to be these distinct patterns of individual differences associated with these two dimensions, highlighting the need to study them separately and take this multi-dimensional approach. The second line of work that I'm going to mention very briefly is on the processes. This is where the least amount of work has been done, but there is some. And this was led by Valeria Capraro in collaboration with me and Brian Earth. And the idea here was that a lot of the work on the dual process model has studied these moral dilemmas by a variety of manipulations, such as time pressure or encouraging participants to rely on intuition or inducing cognitive load, and many different types. And overall, these different manipulations do suggest that under cognitive load, people tend to endorse the utilitarian option significantly less, in line with predictions. What we wanted to do was to study how does this, what happens with impartial beneficence. So we conducted 3 studies, 2 were pre-registered, in which we manipulated cognitive processes through conceptual priming. So for example, participants might read, many people believe that intuition leads to good decision-making. When we rely on automatic gut feelings, we just make better decisions. Whereas other participants read things like, many people believe that reason leads to good decision-making. When we think carefully through a problem, rather than just going on gut feelings, we often make better decisions. And what I'm showing you here is that we've got the average scores on the scale on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we've got the 2 dimensions separately, with darker colors indicating the deliberation conceptual prime condition, and the white bars, the intuition condition. And what we found for instrumental harm, consistent with the dual process model predictions and consistent with all the previous work, when you had participants rely on intuition, they made significantly fewer utilitarian decisions. Interestingly, for impartial beneficence, there was no such pattern. And we replicated this in a second pre-registered study. Now, this is very preliminary evidence, but again, it suggests that there do seem to be different processes underlying instrumental harm and impartial beneficence, or at the very least, that we cannot assume that because the process happens for instrumental harm, it's therefore going to happen for other aspects of utilitarianism. And in this last bit, I just want to talk about social perception. So much of the work on in moral psychology using trolley dilemmas has often focused on what kind of people make these trolley decisions, what kind of processes underlie it. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in as my kind of maybe second main line of work is what social perceptions are there of those who make these decisions? What do these utilitarian or deontological decisions signal to others about the kind of person we are? And what are the consequences of that? So this started in this paper in JEP Journal with Molly Crockett, my PhD supervisor, and Dave Pizarro, in which we were interested in how people infer trust from the kinds of decisions that people make. So what we had was, we had participants and we had them think about a moral dilemma, for example, the footbridge problem. And we said, here's this moral dilemma. What do you think? We then said, now you're going to interact with another person who's also read this dilemma. And this other person either said, killing people is just wrong, even if it has good consequences. They said that, no, you shouldn't push. Or they said you should push. But it's better to save 5 lives rather than 1. And then we had participants rate how moral that other person was. We had them rate how trustworthy the other person was. And we had them play a trust game to try and get a behavioral measure of how trusting they were of the other person. And what we found across a bunch of different studies that I'm really skating over very quickly here and ignoring a lot of the philosophical distinctions we were making between types of deontology. But what we found was that overall in these footbridge style sacrificial dilemmas, the participants viewed someone who made the utilitarian decision as significantly less trustworthy and less moral. And this was seen both in self-report and in this behavioral data from the trust game. So we extended this in a paper in JES, in which we also wanted to look at impartial beneficence. And again, I'm skating over a lot of the details here because I want to get to the most recent work. And the intriguing thing, one of the intriguing things we found here was that, consistent with our predictions, in sacrificial dilemmas, someone who made the consequentialist or utilitarian decision was seen as significantly was seen to make a significantly worse friend than someone who made the deontological judgment. This was the case both for these instrumental harm sacrificial dilemmas and some impartiality dilemmas modeled on those greater good dilemmas that I showed you earlier. That was for suitability as a friend. But when we asked about suitability as a political leader or a president, it was a smaller effect, but we replicated the finding for the sacrificial dilemma. But we found that for the impartiality dilemma, for impartial beneficence, there was a suggestion that a utilitarian leader in the domain of impartial beneficence might be more trusted. This was really interesting to us and not something that we predicted a priori. And so we published this, I went away and I wrote a small grant in the UK so that Molly and I could pursue this further. So we get together, we plan to start it in early 2020, and then, I'm not sure if you heard, but we had a global pandemic, which kind of ruined everything in the world. But it quickly became apparent as we were sitting and talking about and watching this news and watching people's reactions, how many of these moral dilemmas that we've been discussing in moral psychology for years were being played out daily on our TV screens, on Twitter, on Facebook. We were seeing those dilemmas for real every day, and they became real in a way that perhaps they hadn't really to ordinary people before. So for example, we saw dilemmas relating to ventilators and who should get treatment. So there was horror when it became apparent that people should, that people would need to be prioritized based on what decision, based on the availability. But I think where we saw these, the issues most clearly perhaps was in lockdown. So lockdown also raises moral dilemmas. And we saw that when people were describing, when political leaders were talking about these dilemmas, they were faced with quite serious blowback. So Trump was ridiculed for saying that the coronavirus cure could not be worse than the problem itself. And Dan Patrick was slated for this suggestion that there's an exchange and that senior citizens should risk being infected to save the US economy. And even now, Lawrence Fox has joined the London mayor race explicitly on this anti-lockdown ticket. The idea here is that there are trade-offs and that protecting life is not all that matters. And you might think that this is just some kind of like weird right-wing conservative thing, but I don't think it is. And importantly, ethicists don't think it is. So Peter Singer, in this wonderful piece in the New York Times, said, Trump is not wrong on this, that there are trade-offs, and that according to utilitarianism, we need to recognize this trade-off. But consistent with this earlier work from our papers, people were, the leaders who were making these utilitarian judgments here were being slated. Now, this is a problem because we know that trust in leaders is really important for maintaining compliance with public health guidelines. And we know that trust is affected by what kind of moral judgments people make. So we wanted to pivot our work to understand how participants think about the trusted political leaders who are making these kind of judgments in these real moral dilemmas that were playing out in day-to-day life. But again, sacrificial dilemmas like lockdown or ventilators, can reflect instrumental harm, but it's only one type or one dimension of utilitarianism. So the second dimension is what we've called, as I've said, impartial beneficence. And we saw here, for example, where there was outrage when the US bought the world supply of remdesivir, the drug treatment that at the time was thought to be kind of a game changer. Or when Trump asked the medical supply firm to stop sending the PPE to Canada. And indeed now, even though this has happened after data collection that I'll talk about, the IMF has repeatedly cautioned against this idea of vaccine nationalism and this problem of countries hoarding their supplies of vaccine instead of acting impartially for the greater good. And here it seems that that outrage has been generated by the non-utilitarian resolution to these dilemmas. So we wanted to investigate this. We wanted to take this small grant that we'd already obtained and address these questions in this real world, rapidly changing context. So we, Molly Crockett, the senior author, put out this call. And what we did was we did a registered report in 22 countries around the world to try and understand how people trust in leaders based on their moral dilemmas during this global health crisis. We've got a whole bunch of authors from a variety of disciplines in this work, from psychology, philosophy, communication studies, economics, neuroscience, political science, and management studies. And I'd like to, again, especially highlight Clara Colombato, who's a joint first author in this work, and Molly Crockett, the senior author on this, who's been running through most of this, these projects I'm talking about today. And what we wanted to test in this registered report was how these resolutions shape trust in leaders. And in particular, we predicted that an endorsing instrumental harm would reduce trust in leaders, while endorsing impartial beneficence to these COVID dilemmas would increase trust in leaders. So as I just mentioned, we recruited in 22 countries. We obtained broadly representative samples for age and gender in all the countries, not perfectly representative, but broadly representative. And overall, we collected data from more than 22,000 participants overall. We mostly collected data in over a period of 1 month, November to December of last year, just as the peak of cases was really rising again. And we used a variety of different dilemmas to enhance generalizability and to avoid the problem that maybe our effects are just specific to one kind of dilemma. So if we just use lockdown, for example, then it could be that there are these particular features of lockdown that wouldn't generalize to other dilemmas. So what we did with the whole team is that we went through, we watched the news, we read the papers, and we identified these different moral dilemmas that were actually being discussed, that were real moral dilemmas, that were really being discussed in the media, in which that you could frame it at least as there being a characteristically utilitarian and a characteristically non-utilitarian resolution to this dilemma. And we did this in both instrumental harm and impartial beneficence. So for example, the instrumental harm dilemmas included this lockdown, the dilemma of whether to consider reopening or to stay closed. Again, recall that we're doing this before the vaccines have been rolled out, when the cases were highest, like last year. Tracing, so a very strict form of tracing involving people carrying mandatory tracing devices, and whether these should be mandatory or voluntary. Ventilators, which is whether given scarce resources in the hospital, younger people should be prioritized or everyone should have equal access. And for impartial beneficence, for both PPE and for medicine, whether these should be sent wherever in the world that they can do the most good to whoever needs it most, or whether they should be kept at home and prioritized for the home country. And we wanted to include self-report measures of trust, but importantly, we also wanted to try and get a behavioral measure. So what we did was we designed this new behavioral task, this new voting task. And what we did was we had a separate group of participants that we recruited and said, you're going to get a bonus. You can donate some amount to UNICEF and you can keep some. So we got a group of participants, and then we had this group donation to UNICEF. And then we said to our main participants, now in this box, your task in this study is to vote for a leader who's going to be responsible for that group's donations. You can choose either the person who made this characteristically utilitarian decision or the non-utilitarian decision, and you will choose that leader, and then they receive that bonus, and they can choose whether to donate it to UNICEF or to keep for themselves. And we did this in a way that ensured that there was no deception, to adhere to no deception policies. So, results. So recall that this is a registered report. And what we found is that actually our results really mirrored our predictions. So this is the voting task. And what we see is that in instrumental harm, 72% of participants chose the non-utilitarian leader, whereas in impartial beneficence, around this reverse, so that around 60% chose the utilitarian leader. Importantly, this pattern was very comparable across the different dilemmas that we used. It wasn't just one dilemma. And it was comparable across all of the countries. So the effect was always the same in all the countries, even though, as expected, there were slight variations in the strength of the effect sizes between countries. Now, turning to self-report data, we again found that in instrumental harm, the non-utilitarian was seen as more trustworthy than the utilitarian, while in impartial beneficence, this was reversed, so that the utilitarian leader was seen as more trustworthy than the non-utilitarian. This was again the case for all the different dilemmas. The pattern was remarkably similar, and the pattern was very similar across countries, with the sole exception of Israel for the voting task, but not for the self-report task. And so together, these confirmed our predictions laid out in the registered report, showing that instrumental harm reduced trust in the leader, whereas impartial beneficence in these kind of real-world COVID dilemmas increased trust in the leader. And so with that, I come to the end, and we've hopefully got lots of time left for questions and discussion. But I hope that what I've at least partially convinced you is that if we want to understand utilitarianism, we need to take a multidimensional approach. We need to consider both instrumental harm and impartial beneficence. And this is important because they seem to have different psychological correlates. They're distinct psychologically and conceptually, and they seem to rely on different processes. So with that, thank you, and ready for questions.
Thank you. Really interesting work. We have a few questions rolling in, and for those of you who are new to the series, please just feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom if you have questions you'd like Dr. Everett to answer. The first one from my student Julian. So Julian wants to know if you've explored or if you're aware of work that examines how much of a cost people take for endorsing a certain philosophical decision-making style, like the ontology or utilitarianism, but then switch this for certain targets or contexts in a way that may cause them to be considered a hypocrite. The example he uses is like with acting differently between strangers and loved ones. And so I guess to put it differently, the third-party perception effect, how that might vary depending upon the context of use.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not familiar with work directly testing that. There's some interesting work by Jamie Hughes in Texas, I believe, that's been looking at in sacrificial dilemmas, especially how there are different perceptions based on who it is, whether it's a stranger or a loved one. And Ryan McManus and Leanne Young, who was an earlier speaker in this session, have been doing some really interesting work looking at kind of perceptions of close friends and how you should treat people close to you. I'm not sure of any work directly looking at this cost of the switch and if they're considered a hypocrite. That's a really interesting research idea, but I don't know any work directly on that.
So, okay, great, thank you. And then Justin, his question is whether a prescriptive rather than a proscriptive frame might change people's endorsement of impartial beneficence. For example, are people more willing to say that we have a responsibility to help strangers than they are to say that preferentially helping in-group members is wrong?
That's, again, a really fascinating question. And I don't know any work on that. And I think that's part of the issue, as I said at the start of this talk, that there is so much fantastic work on instrumental harm where they've done those kind of studies and we've really learned a lot. But I think because, and there are people now working on impartial beneficence, and it's wonderful to see, but a lot of these really kind of almost low-hanging fruit questions remain unanswered. So I think that is an example of a great study that hasn't been done, and it would be wonderful if it could be done because I think it would be really interesting. But I don't know myself. I haven't done it.
I mean, that question makes me think of, for example, Ronnie Jonah Bullman's work on, motivational bases of different sort, like prescriptions and proscriptions. And that is interesting to consider. So one of my other students, Ileana, has a question. She says, thank you for the great talk. And she was wondering whether you've tried analyzing the COVID data you mentioned at the end of your talk by switching the lockdown to example to be utilitarian equals lockdown, non-utilitarian equals opening. Seems like an argument that could be made both ways. People thinking they have to stay home for the greater good.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And we went back and forth on this actually. So at least at one point, and we're still hoping to do this, we were planning on doing a 2x2. So we would have the lockdown dilemma, and we would either have a characteristically utilitarian or non-utilitarian justification for both versions. Now, the reason we didn't do that is that because we chose to prioritize generalizability. So we wanted to use the multiple dilemmas so that even if there was this issue with one dilemma, that we could see the pattern of results across the different dilemmas. And indeed, they were very consistent. But absolutely, we could conduct this 2x2. And I think that would be really interesting. And we are working on that at the moment. But for that specific registered report project, we made the strategic decision to focus on more dilemmas rather than zoning in on the one dilemma, just because we were concerned about generalizability.
Great, thanks.
And and I should just say that the way that the dilemma was worded it was very clear that one action was characteristically utilitarian and one was deontological. So there wasn't any ambiguity within the specific dilemma that we gave to participants, although I definitely agree that you can frame the broader issue in different ways, and that's really interesting.
I mean, certainly your use of some of these real world COVID responses was a really nice ecologically valid feature of the work. I know when I was looking at I think it was the 5 or 6 different dilemmas you're presenting, I had a question about like at least one of them. Some of them, like I could imagine like coding them as impartial beneficence or instrumental harm. A couple of them seem sort of similar, and so I was curious to hear more about like how you, similar to Ileana's point, how you're conceptualizing the different dilemmas relative to the 2 dimensions of utilitarianism.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So yeah, we drew on, there was a wonderful paper by my postdoc advisor and collaborator supported throughout my PhD, Julian Savulescu, who with colleagues at the Euro Center wrote this very great for us sort of handy guide of what utilitarian says about these different dilemmas. And it talks about lockdown, it talks about ventilators. and it talks about things like PPE in medicine. And you can frame them in different ways, but they were very clearly framed in a way that match the dimension. I don't have the, I'm just having a look if I can. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna reshare my screen if I can do that. Sorry. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Great. So I'll just unhide these and then, yeah, so like for lockdown, the utilitarian leader said, we need to think about all the consequences. Preventing death from COVID isn't all that matters, and continuing these restrictions would have a far worse effect on our overall well-being. This is very similar to things like Peter Singer has said, whereas the non-utilitarian said, as leaders, our primary duty is to protect our citizens, and we must think of our responsibilities towards one another. We can't sacrifice some of our most vulnerable in pursuit of the greater good. For ventilators, the utilitarian person is saying, we have to think about how we can do the most good with what resources we have. And that means that we need to prioritize those who have got the best chance of living a long and healthy life. Whereas a non-utilitarian is saying, look, we can't choose who lives and dies. Everyone has the same right to equal access, and we can't abandon our most vulnerable. And then for the impartial beneficence one, they were quite similar because the dilemmas were quite similar. So the utilitarian is saying COVID-19 is a global pandemic that's affecting all humans. We need to be impartial and send treatment where it can achieve the greatest good. Whereas a non-utilitarian is saying that we've got a right to use our resources to help our own citizens. Other countries can produce their own treatment, or they're responsible for protecting their own citizens. So it would have been helpful if I'd presented that. I was a little bit scared about time, so I skated over that.
No, that
I
is,
hope that clarifies.
that was helpful. Thank you. I mean, it does seem like, I mean, I recall you mentioned Peter Singer and some of the discussions, especially whether it's, reopening universities or reopening or extending kids to in-person school. I mean, some of these trade-offs do heavily implicate these competing, seemingly hard to reconcile goods. And so seeing the concrete stimuli was very helpful. Thank you. So Fred has a question. He wants to know if within the dimension of impartial beneficence, if there are even further distinctions within that potentially. So the Oxford utilitarianism scale, beneficence scale, items are about self-sacrifice and impartiality, but to him, there could be a conceptual distinction between the two. He's wondering if you have any thoughts about further divisions within each of those two dimensions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'd like to highlight that actually Fred is one of the people that has taken this OUS and this kind of distinction of impartial beneficence, and he's doing some really great, interesting work of their own, taking this forward. So that was so wonderful for me to see, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that continue. I do think that there could be a difference. Now, the items do tend to go together, but if you do look at the items, they do tend to go into some that are more about impartiality and some that are more about self-sacrifice. And we sort of saw that in the two greater good dilemmas. One is about whether you should keep some money to buy yourself a car or donate it to charity. And one is about you're going to donate to charity, but do you be impartial or do you be partial? Those items do tend to go together statistically, and they tend to be very correlated. But conceptually, there might be this distinction that we can tease apart further. I am looking at that at the moment in a kind of cross-cultural study looking at data from China and the US, in which we are trying to tease that apart, but it's very much a work in progress at the moment. But preliminarily, if that's a word, they seem to go together quite strongly. But it would be particularly interesting to see in what cases they can come apart.
And I guess, relating this to the COVID context, I mean, it does make me wonder, like, to what degree, I mean, you're capturing this with your data, but to what degree, when people are considering the real world applications of these trade-offs, they are sort of dovetailing these two dimensions and seeing strong overlap. I mean, especially if you think of, questions of vaccine distribution and whether, like, equitable vaccine distribution across different countries, for example, how people are considering that, and, are some coding the same actions as cases of instrumental harm and sacrifices, or the converse, and are some treating it just a matter of maximizing the benefit for the most people across the world. So I imagine there might be some variability in which actions people code as under each of those two dimensions potentially.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So let's see. So we have a few questions in the queue. So Don has a question about whether in your work, does your work relate to an ethical distinction between positive obligations versus negative proscriptions? This might connect back to something Justin raised earlier as well.
Yeah, I mean, it could do. It's not something that's kind of built into what we're doing. It's not an active component of it. It certainly could. And again, I think that's an interesting further direction to go empirically, because we're very much taking an empirical approach towards this. Although I've worked in philosophy departments and collaborated heavily with philosophers, my heart is a psychologist. And so I'm really interested in the data. And so that's something that would be really cool to study empirically, whether participants are perceiving those kind of differences in both dimensions. I think there is some work on instrumental harm, but with impartial beneficence, again, there's not much. But I don't have any concrete specific ideas here. I feel like my Q&A is going very badly here, in that everyone keeps raising these really interesting questions. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great thing that should be done, but I haven't done it yet. So if anyone's interested in pursuing any of this work, please do reach out.
Well, that's often the sign of a productive scientific program, right? Like you keep raising new questions. And so one of my colleagues, Janet, has a question. She says, thank you for your talk. She learned a lot. And she thinks that impartial beneficence, to some degree, I assume you mean deontological, saying more about the distinction between impartial beneficence and deontology. Also, is the impartial beneficence, is that reflective of a longer term perspective? And so might the temporal components of, how does this dimension incorporate the perhaps longer temporal time span perspective?
Interesting. So, yeah, impartial beneficence is quite different to many deontological approaches. And it's tricky. It becomes tricky to really distinguish, in the sense that utilitarianism, or at least classical utilitarianism, as we talk about it in moral psychology, is radically simple, which makes it very amenable to doing this kind of work. It has this single principle that determines whether something's right or wrong. Whereas broadly, deontological theories come under this notion of non-utilitarian or non-consequentialist approaches. And essentially, they're a foil for all of these different kinds of ethical theories that are not consequentialist, are not utilitarian. So you could have kind of contractualist or other contract-based approaches, or you can have Kantian approaches, and each of those would have slightly different views, and they would disagree with utilitarianism, but they can also disagree with each other. So it's quite difficult to identify a clear deontological position for any given issue in the same way that you can identify a clearer utilitarian position. But impartial beneficence is not characteristically deontological, because deontological theories tend to focus in general on obligations and duties. And one of the key duties or obligations that's often referenced is those that we have to people close to us, like friends or family. Whereas utilitarianism is radically impartial in that it says that we can't prioritize those people over people in a far off country. And even that we can't prioritize ourselves over others. It's a radically agent neutral ethical theory, because it's saying that who's doing the action doesn't really matter, and who's the recipient doesn't matter, because everyone is radically equal. Now, sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a ramble here, but Kant is also a radically impartial example of a deontological thinker, but he would still, he would agree with the impartial element, but he wouldn't necessarily agree with the self-sacrificial demanding element that is characteristic of utilitarianism, the idea, for example, that we should donate a kidney to someone. And that relates back to, I think it's Fred's comment about how we might want to distinguish further these two elements within impartial beneficence. So I hope that clarifies a bit. And I now can't remember the second part of the question.
So the second part of the question was essentially just the time span component. Might impartial beneficence be importantly different in the fact that it's arguably, it could involve a further time horizon of consideration?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, I don't know. I mean, I think in some cases it could be to do with a long-term horizon. I think there's a lot of issues here, that there's a lot of psychological biases that can factor in, and we know about some of those, like identifiable victim, biases relating to physical and temporal proximity, but they haven't, that work has kind of studied things adjacent to this, but has rarely been actually incorporated into explicitly our understanding of utilitarianism in moral psychology, which is entirely about instrumental harm. So one of my real desires I really want to do when I can find some time, hopefully after COVID and everything, is to actually try and bring together a review document outlining all these different things that we've done in moral psychology by people over the years, and how that can be brought into this distinction that we're making. Because I think that's going to really help identify what we have learned, what can be applied that isn't being applied at the moment to help us understand, and where some of these questions are coming from in relation to core social psych theory. But I don't think that it's necessary that impartial beneficence is always future focused. It can also happen immediately, like at my computer, I can make a decision right now about where I'm donating this money to or something. So it's not necessary, but I definitely agree that there can be this element that could come into it.
And I suppose by the same token too, with sacrificial harm, I mean, you can think, I mean, some of the classic medical trade-offs, I mean, sacrificing someone's life currently, I mean, presumably many actors in such situations do consider longer temporal consequences as well as part of that.
Yeah.
So one of your collaborators and one of my former collaborators, Walter Senator Armstrong, has a nice question that building off this point. So another feature of utilitarianism is that it looks far into the future, whereas the ontology is usually concerned with more immediate effects. This issue affects attitudes to climate change, for example. Would you expect people's willingness to count effects far in the future to correlate with one of your two dimensions, impartial beneficence or instrumental harm? If not, would that show that long-term forecasting is a potential third dimension of the utilitarian mindset?
Interesting. So I think part of that relates to Janet's question before. And again, I'd say that an element of this time element could potentially feature into both. In some of the work that we have done with climate change, I think one of the items that we've used was, should people make sacrifices now to protect or to preserve the climate, preserve the environment for future generations? It was worded in some way like that. And we found with that item that that was correlated with, that was negatively correlated with instrumental harm. But that was in our first cognition paper. So we haven't done that again, looking at the scores on the Oxford Utilitarianism scale. But based on those original results, we could at least say that it's unlikely to be associated with instrumental harm. Would I say that long-term forecasting is a third dimension of utilitarianism? Now, I think that this really depends on what we mean by a dimension of utilitarianism, because I think that there are many different conceptual dimensions that we could tease apart. So we could say that long-term forecasting is one element. We could say that mission distinction is another dimension. And so on purely philosophical grounds, we could further subdivide both of the dimensions more. But part of the motivation behind this 2D model was to do it psychologically or bottom up in a way. So we had, I think, 93 various items associated with different types of ethical theories in utilitarianism. And we gave them all to participants, and we did the factor analysis and the statistic analysis to see what factors emerged. And it was the case that impartial beneficence emerged as a factor and instrumental harm emerged. So theoretically, there could be other dimensions, and we certainly don't rule that out, but at least on the data we have, it's not clear that they're constituting a significant dimension that participants are perceiving in the same way that they are for the other two. But one thing that we have changed is, especially in the TICS paper, we leave it much more open whether, I think one of the issues perhaps with our psych review paper is that we call it the 2D model. We're very much framing it in terms of 2 dimensions. And one of the things that we try to do in the TICS paper is to be more like, it's a multidimensional approach. We're not committed to saying that there are 2 dimensions, but the key idea is that there's not one, there's more than one. And maybe there's others, but the data and evidence we have at the moment suggests that there's 2. Yeah.
Great. So we have one question still in the queue, and others, if you have comments, please feel free to pitch them in the Q&A. Ileana has a follow-up point, going back a few minutes in the conversation to something about close versus distant others and the impartiality there. She wonders if you've considered whether norms of self-interest, in the sense by D.L. Miller and others, might be contributing to the findings for the negative social perception of utilitarians. So in as much as there's apparently some unpublished work showing that some variation of this might be accounting for negative perceptions. So for example, with perceptions of pro-social behavior being seen as potentially more inauthentic with higher degrees of pro-sociality. This is work by Barry that she's talking about.
Interesting. No, so the 2 main things that we focused on in trying to understand why utilitarians might be distrusted, we focused on this difficulty of predicting what a utilitarian might do in a given context, given that they have to weigh up the pros and cons. It's not as easy as for a deontologist who says, oh, you should always do X. You can reasonably predict that in a new situation, they will do X. So that's one thing we've looked at. And another thing we've looked at is this perception that utilitarians lack an emotional commitment to social cooperation, or they're cold or unfeeling somehow. We haven't studied what you're suggesting specifically. That is interesting. I'm not sure how much a norm of I mean, I think I just need to read those papers a bit more. I'm not terribly familiar with that work. I think certainly an element of self-interest could be at play, but also, at least in the dilemmas that we've used and others used, people are making decisions about hypothetical cases, typically. And so it's difficult to see how that self-interest could come in, with the trolley dilemma and kind of medical moral dilemmas. And with the COVID, potentially, if you're a young person, but I'm not sure. That's again an interesting dimension for future direction for future research.
Yeah, well, that's at this point, that looks like all the open questions that we have. A nice comment from Janet about your talk. So yeah, I do think, one interesting thing, building off what Ileana is saying, I've always wondered, as someone who studied empathy for the sorts of mass suffering events like COVID, and people's insensitivity to them, like how to make sense of that dovetailing with different forms of utilitarianism. And in particular, to the degree that we might think that people are, in some cases, inhibited against letting themselves feel empathy for these large scale events, how considerations not only of one's own impartial beneficence, but then, what do third-party observers think if you open yourself up to feeling empathy as much for people suffering all around the world as for someone suffering in your home locale, wherever that happens to be. And so I wondered, I guess some of your greater good dilemmas in your earlier work do look at least impartial empathy extended outwards through behavior like in donation. But I'm curious if you've ever considered in more depth the connection, or in additional depth, the connection between things like the identifiable victim effect, compassion collapse, and your two dimensions of utilitarianism.
Not, again, not explicitly. There clearly are relations with the identifiable victim, or there can be relations with the identifiable victim effect, but critically it depends on whether the greater number of victims achieves more good than the one person. I think that there's probably, yeah. So I'm not as much of an expert on empathy as you are, obviously, but I've always been particularly interested in this, as you mentioned, this strategic element to empathy, which is something that very much took me by surprise when I first started reading about it, because I was like, I'd never considered that. And then suddenly it was like a light bulb. And I think that does come out here. But I think there's a protective element here that could help to explain why people are actually even fairly low on impartial beneficence. And as you say, it's quite difficult to start opening yourself up to feeling empathy for the whole world. When you're feeling empathy for those close to you, I already feel bad enough that I'm not doing enough to help my mom and my sisters and my grandmother. When I start opening myself up to also treating the lives of everybody in the world to the same extent, that can almost become overload for me. It becomes too demanding as a theory, but it becomes psychologically just too much for me to deal with. So I do think that there can be this protective element to that, and perhaps it's a kind of a conscious strategic element. Maybe it's more implicit or unconscious, but I think that would be very interesting. But yeah, I'd love to talk more. And if you have any specific suggestions for empathy papers that you think would be particularly good for me to delve into, I would very much appreciate that, because it's an area that I haven't thought massively about, or I haven't delved into it in as much depth as I would like to.
Well, sure. Happy to chat further. It does seem like broadly some of there's a common sometimes concern you hear with response to whether we should cultivate empathy on a large scale across, like, expand our moral circle and in an empathic sense, but also the burdens of utilitarianism. And as you yourself noted, like how it sometimes doesn't seem to fully, it seems counterintuitive to certain kinds of ordinary common sense morality. Walter, so maybe we'll close the last point from Walter, who's asking if, presenting the case, so some people seem willing to allow harm to one person in order to, so basically the allow versus cause distinction, allowing harm to one person in order to help more, but still not willing to actively cause harm themselves in order to help more. Do you have any evidence of how many people show this pattern? If so, it might be two sides of the instrumental harm dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, again, we did have some items in the original scale development procedure that some were more akin to on both sides. I don't have any evidence on how many people show this pattern, but I definitely share the intuition that that's at least, it seems a relevant distinction to us. And I think participants would differentially endorse it. I suppose people, I think some people would distinguish between the two. I'm not sure that most people would perhaps distinguish between the two consistently, at least. But I guess that's an open question, but I just don't know again. But that would be interesting if, yeah, we can further divide the instrumental harm dimension like we might be able to do for impartial beneficence as well.
Well, it looks like that's, as far as I can tell, last call for any questions for Dr. Everett.
And I feel free to shoot me an email. My website is jimaceverett.com, and you can just type in Jim Everett Psychology. And my email's there. So if you have any more questions or you want to follow up, please do shoot me an email and we can talk about this more.
And I do also want to mention you're organizing an international moral psychology series that folks are curious about.
Yeah, so the idea behind this was just to create a list, and we're organizing this seminar series, bringing together people who are doing moral psychology work from around the world to be able to share that. So we don't have a chat here, but I guess if you search international moral psychology list in Google, it might come up with something. If not, maybe if there's internally a pen, Daryl can send it around. But yeah, if you just Google international moral psychology list, it looks like it comes up on Google. And then you can sign up and then you'll find out about our seminar series as well. We meet every 3 weeks and it's free and publicly available to everyone. And we've had some really interesting talks so far. And yeah, we're really excited about it. Thanks for mentioning that, Daryl.
Sure. One of the, although obviously the broader context of COVID and having to Zoom is sort of, it presents its own limitations. But I mean, I think one of the great upshots is being able to network digitally with scholars from around the world, including yourself, some of the former speakers like Lasana Harris and Brock Bastian as well, who may not otherwise have been able to, or it may have been a lot harder to bring you all in for an in-person talk.
I mean, I'm just very thankful to Daryl because I was incredibly worried that my internet was going to be a problem. So it looks like the internet gods took that too literally and transferred it over across the Atlantic, and it caused problems with Daryl. So I'm very sorry about that, Daryl.
Can you hear me okay now? Any better now?
Yes.
Nothing? Yeah. Oh, no, you can hear me. I can hear. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. No, well, yeah, maybe this is a sign it's time to cut it off. But thank you, Dr. Everett, for joining us. As a special reminder, in 2 weeks, we're trying to organize a special panel that will convene Jim, but also Leanne Young, Brock Bastian, and who else did we get? Lasana Harris, yes. So Adam Waits and Jay Van Babel can't make it, but it's 4 of the 6 of us, 4 of the 6 of the speakers, and then myself will talk about empathy in a sort of informal roundtable discussion. That's about 2 weeks from today. I'll send a note about that if any of you are interested. But otherwise, thank you very much for giving a great concluding talk to the series, and stay healthy and stay well.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.